Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this talk on the life and work of one of the stars of the French musical world, Jeanne Demessieux. For organists, her reputation as the composer of fiendishly difficult music is probably how she's most well known. For others, she may be a less familiar name. Her reception and legacy will be a central part of this overview, which aims to illuminate the many different facets of her short but incredibly distinguished life. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to organists and scholars who have championed her works and her performance career to date. Their contribution to the knowledge is invaluable and is a central part of this talk, along with reviews and recordings. In this, the centenary year of her birth, we celebrate her remarkable legacy. Jeanne Demessieux was born in Montpellier on the 13th of February 1921. Her parents quickly recognized their daughter's prodigious musical ability. I was struck by one particular anecdote which described an occasion where she attended an opera aged 3 with her family, was completely absorbed by the entire performance, and sang one of the arias later at home. So quite clearly not your average 3-year-old. Jeanne's sister Yolande, who was 14 years her senior, was responsible for her earliest music education, and which involved, at the age of 4, devoting 2 hours daily to piano practice and 2 more hours to solfège and dictation. She wrote her first compositions at age 5, and in the same year, her piano repertoire already included some of the partitas and preludes and fugues of Bach. She was enrolled in the Montpellier Conservatoire in 1928, and by the age of 11, had won first prizes in piano and solfège. The Demessieux family relocated to Paris in 1932, where she could receive the best education, and the following year, she began studying piano at the Paris Conservatoire. There, she won 6 first prizes for harmony in 1937, for piano in 1938, for counterpoint and fugue in 1939, and for organ and improvisation in 1941. The Demessieux were a devout Catholic family, so when they arrived in Paris, they joined the newly built church of Saint-Esprit. Jeanne became organist of the church in 1933, which initially involved playing the harmonium, and she held this position for nearly 30 years, until she was appointed organist of La Madeleine in 1962, only 6 years before she died. Demessieux met Marcel Dupré in Meudon on the 8th of October 1936, a meeting which she described as an unforgettable rendezvous in her diary. By this time, Dupré had been professor of organ at the Conservatoire for 10 years, and for 2 years had served as titular organist of Saint-Sulpice. At this meeting, Dupré said to Jeanne's mother, "From now on, I'm taking this child under my artistic wing." Demessieux studied with Dupré for 3 years before entering his organ class at the Paris Conservatoire in 1939. And following the Premier Prix in organ in 1941, she continued studying privately with Dupré for 5 more years. Intense study ensued of all the major organ works, including Dupré's works, and he pushed the limits of her virtuosity by writing extremely difficult compositions to develop her technique to a level of complete perfection. Dupré carefully curated Demessieux's performance career, beginning with her debut on the 26th of February, 1946, at the age of 25. Here I turn to Darcy Trinquo's wonderful work, where he describes how the legend begins. Dupré arranged for Demessieux what he called 6 historic recitals at the Salle Pleyel in Paris. He carefully planned out every detail: the venue, the organ restoration, the setting of the stage, the works. There was an audience of 1,725. This was apparently considerably more than would be expected for a debut recital on any instrument in Paris at that time. Reaction across the board was one of amazement. Her debut was compared to the likes of Harvitz and Menuhin, while Dupré, who was in attendance along with many other leading Parisian organists, Litez, Laoghaire, Grunewald, and Falcinelli, exclaimed that next to Jeanne Demessieux, the rest of us play the pedals like elephants. Dupré exclaimed, "You have shown us this evening that we are in the presence of a phenomenon equal to the youth of Bach or Mozart." She was a superstar, mobbed by fans looking for autographs. These recitals were a complete triumph, and she received endless invitations to perform abroad in concert halls, churches, and cathedrals. And on many of these occasions, she was the first woman to play in the venue. Within 4 years, she had given 200 recitals. She drew full audiences, and within a few years had played nearly every major European city. Her London debut was the 26th of February 1947 at Westminster Cathedral, where she returned many times. Interestingly, and unlike the audience there, English critics were fairly hostile towards her. The London Organ Music Society wanted her to audition for them, which she refused. Dupré had been planning and insisting that she perform in America, but she refused to go without the best terms and conditions. And suddenly and shockingly, Dupré cut all contact with her and never spoke to her again. She was distraught and later said she would never have survived the ordeal without the support of her parents. This is detailed in Lynn Kavanagh's The Rise and Fall of a Famous Collaboration, Marcel Dupré and Jeanne Demessieux. It's a very interesting read. Demessieux eventually undertook 3 tours of America, but not until 1953, with the second and third tours taking place in 1955 and 58. Laura Ellis's detailed account of these tours is documented in the American recital tours of Jeanne Demessieux in the Diapason. Apparently, she didn't enjoy touring, finding it exhausting, and preferring instead to stay near her aging parents. She also refused to travel by plane unless it was absolutely necessary. So I'd like to turn at this point to her trips to Ireland, which I'm sure she enjoyed. There are more of these than I expected to find. From the research, it seems that she gave 6 different performances here. There may have been others that I've yet to discover, and I did see mention of masterclasses in Dublin, but the following 6 performances have been listed by the Irish Times. On the 10th of April, 1948, the first advertisement for a recital by Jeanne Demessieux appeared, scheduled for St. Patrick's Cathedral at 8 p.m. on the 28th of April, 1948, and under the auspices of the Leinster Society of Organists and Choirmasters. It's the first of a number of advertisements for this performance in the Irish Times. These include details of her remarkable career, and she was only 27 years old at this stage. They mention that her technique was acclaimed as unbelievably brilliant, and also give an outline of the program to include works by Dupré, Bach, and Handel. They indicate that the conclusion of the recital will be an improvisation on a theme set by Dr. Hewson. Reviews appear in the Irish Times on the 29th and 30th of April, particularly representative of the time. Women organists are rare, for the organ is not an instrument that is suited to the feminine temperament, and its technique is generally more easily mastered by a man. Miss Demessieux is, however, the exception. Her technique is of amazing fluency and dexterity, and has a brilliance that very few organists have achieved. From these reviews, we learned that her recital drew a large audience, and further details about the programs, such as the performance of the Bach D major, Chorale Preludes, the Handel Concerto in B flat, and the Franck A minor Chorale. Despite mentioning her brilliance, clarity, and precision, they were also of the opinion that the Chorale Prelude, Jesus Christ Our Saviour, was mechanical, and the dexterous manual work became a maze of notes without meaning. Also, the Franck A minor Chorale, they say that this was not held together convincingly, and the middle section suffered from very angular and halting rhythm. The following are a few excerpts from another review, which is also certain of its time. That Jeanne Demessieux is not only the first woman to give an organ recital in St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, but also the first woman ever to give an organ recital in Westminster Cathedral, is due not to anti-feminist feelings on the part of cathedral authorities, but to the fact that very few women organists ever attain the first rank. She is described as a shy, slim, pretty girl, 27 years old, dressed smartly, but not fashionably, in a fawn coat, short skirt, and large brown beret. The reviewer describes how she spoke as little English as he spoke French, so an exhaustive interview was out of the question. He says, "I gathered that this was her first visit to Ireland and that she was greatly impressed by St. Patrick's Cathedral, particularly the interior. The organ in the cathedral too pleased her. It is one of the best I have ever played," she told me. He asked her if she had any interests outside music, and she replied, "Oh yes," immediately and emphatically, but they couldn't continue the conversation due to the language barrier. He writes, "Not having heard any of her work, I asked her, what style of music did she compose? She answered that question without a moment's hesitation or trace of shyness. My own," she said, "I hope." Notice of her second Irish performance appeared on the 7th and 8th of May 1951, this time in Christchurch, Leeson Park, and scheduled for 8 p.m. on the 9th of May 1951. Again, under the auspices of the Leinster Society of Organists and Choirmasters. One of the advertisements says, "The organ is an instrument of such complexity and of such exacting physical demands that women have rarely come to prominence as players, but Mademoiselle Demessieux, a slender, reserved Parisienne, has already made an international reputation as an executant of unusual brilliance." Noting her program to include Liszt's Fantasia on Adnos, works by Bach, Franck, and Dupré, and some études of her own composition, Mademoiselle Demessieux plays from memory and must be the only academic organist who plays in high-heeled shoes. Again, the close. The day after the recital, a stellar review appeared, noting that it was recorded for broadcast by Radio Éireann, and providing details of her program and electrifying improvisation on Okuma Manuel. A testament to her stardom is the announcement in the social and personal section of the Irish Times on Friday the 11th that Demessieux, who was staying in the Royal Hibernian Hotel, has returned to Paris. Her third Irish performance took place on the 19th of November 1952, the infamous St. Peter's Fidgsberg recital, and a review appeared 2 days later. Entitled "Brilliant Organ Technique," we can reconstruct more or less the program she played. The review is again extremely positive and notes that in Demessieux's performance of her study for repeated notes, the 8-foot pedal work is played with very high-heeled shoes, and perhaps the difficulty of execution was not realized by the average listener. This led to the improvisation of Prelude, Chorale, and Fugue on 3 themes given respectively by Messrs. Gruco, Watson, and Swanton. The facility which Mademoiselle Demessieux invents with these intricate musical designs is remarkable. It was a pity that her strong fugal development of a subject, which lent itself to so many scientific and contrapuntal devices, had to be hurried to a conclusion owing to the time limit for the broadcast of the recital. Such a musical experience is indeed rare and will not soon be forgotten in Dublin. Most fascinating was the Irish Times announcement of her 4th Irish appearance. Under the auspices of Waterford Music Club, an organ recital by Jeanne Demessieux will be relayed from the Dominican Church in that town at 7:50. She will play pieces by Bach, Mozart, and Dacan. I was not expecting that. She returned to St. Peter's Fidgsberg for her 5th performance in Ireland on the 21st of April, 1953. Advertisements appeared at the end of March, and this was one of 3 recitals in a series in Dublin in April 1953. The other 2 recitals were given by William Watson in Christchurch Cathedral and FCJ Swanton in Christchurch Leeson Park. Again, we can reconstruct her programme to a point from this review, which overall was less favourable than the others. Still, her playing from memory without fuss or delay is noted, along with many other positive comments, her fine organ sense, pedalling, phrasing, and rhythm. Apparently, however, the chorale prelude was ponderous and lacked poetry and tenderness, and although they looked forward to the concluding improvisation, having in mind the recitalist's previous excellent performances, they had to suffer disappointment. The texture of the opening promised well, but developed slowly. The submitted theme had not sufficient possibilities for varied treatment and did not give a hint of a fugue subject. A similar surprise in the research was the notice of a recital in Mullingar. On the 2nd of January 1953, we see the first mention of this as part of the ontostal arrangements for the town. A visit from Mademoiselle Jeanne Demessieux is planned, who will give an organ recital of sacred music in the Cathedral of Christ the King, by permission of the Most Reverend Dr. Kyne, Bishop of Meath. So presumably she headed down to Mullingar Cathedral the day after Fidgsberg for her recital on Wednesday, the 22nd of April at 8:30 p.m, in a similar way to her trip to Waterford after Fidgsberg. It seems that this was her last recital in Ireland, the last I've sourced at least. Shortly afterwards, on the 2nd of June 1953, she played by invitation of Queen Elizabeth at her coronation in Westminster Abbey. Airtime in Ireland continued to be given to performances by Demessieux, and FCJ Swanton is listed as including works by Demessieux in his own organ recitals. Within the framework of both the Dublin International Organ Festival, which is now Pipeworks, and the subscription series of the National Symphony Orchestra, Dame Gillian Weir gave a performance of Guillemot's Symphony No. 1 for organ orchestra, alongside Demessieux's poem of 1949, and this was in a concert in the National Concert Hall on the 24th of June 1994. It's fantastic to see that almost 30 years later, Pipeworks is still programming works of Jeanne Demessieux and continuing her strong connection with the island of Ireland. While it's great to have these documented accounts of visits with details of dates and repertoire and personal impressions of her performances by reviewers, these are limited and subjective, as we've clearly seen. So luckily we have evidence of her remarkable playing in the form of recordings. Many of these are now available on YouTube, and in 2021, Decca Records released an 8 CD box set with her complete recordings for this label between 1947 and 1967. Her recordings include some of the most iconic works in the repertoire, some of which I'll play for you now. To give a brief overview of her recitals in general, she offered very balanced programs, and the Irish programs were indicative of the sort of structure. Usually they comprised a major Bach work, a more expressive work like a chorale prelude, a light crowd pleaser like a trumpet tune, or smaller works like the Dakam, more substantial works of Franck or Liszt, and always an improvisation. Despite playing so much of Dupré's music during her studies with him, she featured some of his works in her earliest recitals, but rarely later on. She only played 3 20th century composers with any regularity, and they were Messiaen, Reveille, and her own works. In terms of Messiaen, Demessieux was one of his first and most powerful advocates, and he admired her greatly. He often invited her to be an examiner for his analysis class at the Conservatoire, and she was going to make a complete recording of his works before she died. Both Demessieux and Reveille loved jazz, particularly the music of Duke Ellington, and we can clearly hear this jazz influence in the following recording. It's lots of fun, and it's a recording of Demessieux on the cavaille call organ of La Madeleine in a work titled Mouvement by Bovet. In this next recording, we're given even more of a sense of the energy of Demessieux's performances. We hear her virtuosity and drive, but also the clarity of her playing. In her performances, there's never a jumble of notes, and we can always hear the different parts, the beautiful phrasing and line. It's always buoyant and seems almost electric. Here we have an extract from Liszt's Fantasia on Adnos. This is from the Fugue. And in this next performance, we hear Demessieux playing one of her own compositions, the Te Deum, again on the Cavaille organ of La Madeleine, and you heard a bit of this in the opening. Across the board, from most of the accounts of others, and from what is very clear from the recordings we have, her performances were full of clarity, virtuosity, expression, warmth, energy, rhythmic drive, power, and strength. They always have this strong sense of line and are always singing. She herself remarked that the performer has her rights, so her performances were unlike those of the organ reform movement which followed, and as a result, Demessieux's style became unpopular. As we've seen, Demessieux was an incredible improviser, and luckily we have some recorded examples of these. She improvised in every recital, beginning in the first of her 6 historic recitals, where she improvised a 4-movement symphony. She also did this in her recital in London in March 1947, to which George Thalben Ball remarked that it was a trick improvisation because no one can think that fast. In Liège in 1957, she improvised an entire concert in a range of forms. The following recording demonstrates Demessieux's ingenious development of this angular theme. The entire improvisation is relentless. This extract is of the final few minutes of a performance in Haarlem. That was the theme, and this is the later extract. Well, Demessieux taught throughout her career, initially about 25 hours per week, as well as the 14 to 15 hours in Saint-Esprit. On top of her 8 hours practice per day, her composition, and her concert schedule. Darcy Trinquant speaks about her teaching, noting that while she was as exacting with her pupils as she was with herself, she managed this imperceptibly, and their testimonies speak always of her kindness, warmth, and encouragement as a teacher, and her unlimited generosity in encouraging them to achieve their maximum. So many accounts and memories of Demessieux recall that, as well as her extraordinary abilities, she was a really lovely person. As a teacher, Demessieux had occasionally substituted for Dupré at the Paris Conservatoire, but all that ended after the rupture. She was appointed in 1950 to a position in the Conservatoire in Nancy, and in 1952, she was appointed professor of organ at the Royal Conservatoire in Liège, Belgium. Some of her exceptional students include Pierre Labrick, and Louis Theory. When we look at the musician that she was and how successful a performing career she had and teaching career, one wonders when and how it was possible that she had this time to compose, which she did, writing more than 30 compositions, about a third of which were for organ. She also composed for piano, a number of songs, and a handful of other works. About half of her output has been published as of 2021. In Demessieux's works, we find music suitable for every organist. So I turn now to the Chorale Preludes Opus 8, and from this set, Ophélie. This is a recording taken from one of the very many lockdown recitals given by David Lee in St. Patrick's Cathedral. We hear the tune Ophélie presented in a series of characterful variations, using a number of different motivic elements and exploiting the many different tonal possibilities of the instrument. It is a charming miniature and gives a sense of Demessieux's musical imagination. The Te Deum I played earlier, which was performed by Demessieux herself, would perhaps be of moderate difficulty, similar in ways to the likes of Repos pour le temps du Pâques, but in no way as demanding as the Etudes. For the ambitious organist, here we see the complexity of her writing and a strong sense of harmonic language. She uses a very wide range of colors and textures in these studies, and of course, there are the obvious extreme technical demands placed on the player. When you look at the score, which is under copyright, it's a sea of octaves, this next study I'll play for you. But despite this, there's always melodic writing, and you see this across the board in the studies, as you do in all her works. The following extract is from a recital given by Darcy Trinquon in Westminster Cathedral in 2018, marking the 50th anniversary of her death. And it's the last movement, the last study, octaves number 6. Dupré was asked to present Demessieux's studies. The following quotations are taken from his preface to the work with a translation by David Pizarro. These etudes are the epitome of the contemporary technique of the organ. If one examines them separately, each one, a sort of partial mirror of the technique of the author, deals with one peculiarity of execution and aims at the development of a definite skill. Dupré proceeds to document the skills and challenges of each study before summarizing that the qualities of execution which the conscientious study of the etudes will develop are equality, simultaneousness of attack, legato, flexibility, lightness, and clarity. The work is known when the interpreter has, from memory, an exact mental picture, and when the limbs execute it with suppleness of a reflex manner. At this moment, the liberated brain can give of itself completely to the music. Those who succeed in conquering these etudes will be grateful to Jeanne Demessieux for immense progress, which, thanks to her, they will have accomplished. Despite the stardom of her youth, she faced many obstacles later on, including the rupture with Dupré and the problems arising from that, as well as her long struggle battling cancer. She passed away at the age of only 47. One, of course, wonders what may have followed had she lived a long life, but the legacy she leaves is remarkably rich and full. I hope that this overview has provided a sense of how extraordinarily full and special Jeanne Demessieux's short life was, as well as the significance of her performances and the importance of her compositions for us today. I'm very grateful to Pipeworks for hosting this talk, to Professor Gillen and Derek Verso for their research suggestions, and the brilliant work of scholars and organists including Lynn Kavanagh, Laura Ellis, Karen E. Ford, Joe Eving Anderson, Christopher Brown Teal, and many others, including her past students who've championed her life and works these past years. I'm particularly grateful to Darcy Trinquan for his outstanding work in this field. In terms of Demessieux's works, there is a piece for every organist. The chorale preludes are a perfect introduction to liturgical repertoire akin to the organ Buchlein. There is also the more demanding repertoire, such as the Te Deum. And for the ambitious, there are endless challenges in the studies. Demessieux's outstanding and multifaceted career as a virtuoso organist, church organist, teacher, improviser, and composer provides endless paths for further study. And there is still so much more to discover of her incredible life and works. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the summer.